Department of State sponsored program partner, and we connect emerging leaders from around the world with their counterparts here in Detroit through international exchange to promote citizen diplomacy and to elevate Detroit's status as a global city. So we've been holding this virtual talk series since April of last year when we moved from in-person programming to virtual. And we're excited to keep providing a platform for Detroit leaders to showcase their expertise with our community and our larger international network. Today's virtual talk is being presented in partnership with the Gulf Coast Diplomacy in Pensacola, Florida. So I'd like to welcome our colleagues there and their members. Hi, Gina. I also wanted to quickly remind everyone to please mute yourselves while our speakers are presenting. And if and when any questions come up, you can just go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll monitor that and get to your questions answered at the end of the discussion. So our moderator today is a global citizen and a valued partner of Global Ties Detroit. I'm happy to introduce David Teolis, the Assistant Director of International Economics at General Motors, and also a Global Ties Detroit board member. So he'll be moderating this conversation with Kevin Cassidy, Director and Representative to the Bretton and Multilateral organizations for the ILO. So thank you for being here. And David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa. And I also want to say thank you to Marian for your leadership within the Global Ties organization and your work in promoting global exchange and citizen diplomacy. General Motors is a very proud participant in the many international exchange programs that you help organize, and we look forward to our continued involvement in the future programs. And again, I also want to thank Gulf Coast Diplomacy for co-hosting this event. Thank you. And again, as Melissa already mentioned, if you have questions, please insert them into the chat box, and I will do my best to incorporate them into the discussion. But before we start, let me first introduce our special guest. Our guest is Kevin Cassidy of the International Labor Organization. He has nearly 4 decades of international development experience. His current role is Director and Representative to the Bretton Woods and Multilateral organizations. Mr. Cassidy has also served in several other capacities within the ILO, including Senior Communications and Economic and Social Affairs Officer, and Chief Technical Advisor for the ILO's Global Campaign on Promoting Fundamental Rights at Work. Mr. Cassidy has also worked in several United Nations offices during his career, including Department of Peacekeeping Operations, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, and the Executive Office of the Secretary General, especially under Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Ban Ki-moon. Mr. Cassidy holds a Master's of Economics and Political Development from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Welcome, Kevin, and thank you for joining us today. Kevin, why don't we first start with you? Tell us a little bit about the ILO's mission. Give us, what is your role globally, and probably highlight some of the things that you do for the ILO.
Thanks. The ILO is probably one of the best kept secrets of the UN system. The ILO actually is the first multilateral organization. It was created in 1919 out of the Treaty of Versailles, and it met before the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN. What is the ILO? The ILO is a technical agency of the UN system that looks at the issues in the world of work. It has a very unique characteristic, which is a tripartite nature, which means that governments, workers, and employers sit together at the table to discuss these issues. So by having the actors of the real economy, we're able to develop a kind of a rights-based framework in the world of work. In 1919, there were many competing economic models. And so the ILO was kind of there at the beginning to help form the rules of the road. These are not bureaucrats developing it, but it is the workers, employers, and governments sitting down and negotiating and compromising and developing the convention system. The ILO has a technical advisory role, and we inform our 187 countries about the labor legislation. And we also have a seat at the table with the G7, the G20, the OECD, the World Bank, and the IMF. So we're really an economic actor because work sits at that important nexus between the social and the economic. Maybe just instructive of what we do, the ILO in its preamble, which is more poetry than most documents today, says that whereas lasting and universal peace can be established only if based on social justice and the belief that labor is not a commodity. So we are a rights-based institution. We help set the rules of the road. So things that businesses listening today know about: minimum age, maternity leave, child labor, human trafficking, non-discrimination in employment, occupational safety and health. All of these come out of the ILO. We convene the global actors to sit and discuss globalization to create a level playing field. And we in Washington, just so you have a sense of what we do in the US, is we don't do development cooperation projects. We do that in developing countries. But we share knowledge and we create collaborative activities through meetings and discussions, sharing and leveraging the knowledge of our experts from around the world. We have a very robust research department. We have a very big statistical department. I personally will negotiate and speak with the Department of Labor, Department of State, USTR, and with members of Congress about the work we do, and providing testimony on hearings on, for example, GSP for countries like Uzbekistan, and about the work that's taking place there and the changes in those countries.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. And that's a very good background. It shows how involved you are with the world and have such great knowledge about the global labor market. I also want to encourage the audience to, after this call, to even visit the ILO's webpage at ilo.org. It's I had some time leading up to this discussion to look at the webpage, look at the various amount of research and data, and great graphics that they show where you could compare countries and look at different types of categories of labor. And it's very, very interesting website. So I encourage you to the audience to visit the website. I want to break up this conversation, Kevin, with basically 3 parts. I want to look at what's happened before the pandemic. I think sometimes when you look at the past, it gives us some better perspective on what the future is. We'll segue to the what's the year of the pandemic and what are some of the key issues that stemmed from the pandemic, and then we'll work into the future beyond the pandemic. So if you could step back a little bit and say, how would you characterize the health of the global labor market before we entered the pandemic, during 2020? Was the labor market, global labor market, really moving in a positive direction, in a good trend?
David, thanks for that, because I think it is instructive to see where we've come from and where we're going. In January of 2020, we came out with our World Employment and Social Outlook. And that was also at the end of the ILO centenary celebration. We commemorated our 100 years in 2019. The ILO saw a world that was struggling in the labor markets. We had 500 million people who had insufficient access to paid work. A lot of these people were wanting to work more hours but couldn't find them. There were people who were unemployed, and a growing workforce of 2.5 million per year. We're meaning that without proper job creation, that there are going to be dislocations. And as we know, economic problems spill over into the social sphere as well. There were also 630 million people, almost 1 in 5 workers worldwide, who were living in extreme poverty. So this did not paint a very pleasant picture. Many of the jobs that we saw, and again, the ILO is an international organization, so we do talk about developing and emerging economies. And a lot of the jobs around the world tend to be in the informal economy. They were low paid, insecure. People didn't have access to social safety nets. I mean, this is very important. It's an automatic stabilizer that helps you overcome the shocks of the loss of income. One of the other things that we've seen, and I think many people here who are economists will know, that the share of labor income as compared to those who are holders of capital had declined by 54% over 15 years. So it's an amazing change in prospects that labor itself, using your skills, your talent, your industry, your knowledge to take a job, was not as fruitful or as efficient in generating income as those who hold capital. So labor markets were extremely unequal in its outcomes, and more extreme than we had thought. So where were the best situations? Where were the worst? I think the best, by intuition, we'll say high income countries and upper middle income countries, where unemployment rates had declined, but were starting to stall. But the high employment growth itself also was at the expense of labor productivity. So jobs that were being added in less productive services. Where were the worst scenarios in the beginning of 2020? Upper middle income countries and low income countries. So for example, Argentina, Brazil, and Turkey. they were facing a lot of economic crises that were largely due to labor underutilization. So this was a job gap that was not expected to improve. Also, low-income growth and the lack of inclusivity made it difficult to make improvements in working conditions and to reduce poverty in low-income countries. For the ILO, one of the maxims that came out of our Declaration of Philadelphia back in 1944, just before the UN came into being, is to say that poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere. So I think we look at this in more of the entire workforce, in the global workforce, and really quite important to address those issues for both those who have been successful and those less so.
Yeah, and so basically you're highlighting, there's this whole widening of the income inequality that we talk so often about, especially among economists, even beyond economists as well. And this whole issue of income inequalities, you kind of highlighted perfectly. It's also not just within countries, but how we could look at it much broader as well, and showing that it's important to have coordination among countries, which again is what's key about your organization, that create this coordination to help everybody become better and create a more global, inclusive labor market. But let's move into the the area of the pandemic, the year of the pandemic, and with the benefit of the ILO website, it's easier to type than it is to say. The ILO reported that there is 114 million jobs that were lost during 2020 due to the pandemic. Now, this is important. So when you combine the jobs lost with the reduction of hours, so those who are working and saw less hours because of lockdowns or restrictions, the job equivalent losses total 255 million jobs. That's 4 times higher than the global financial crisis. And this equates to 3.7 trillion in lost labor income, which basically is what you've already highlighted. So is there further, could you drill down further to talk about which countries and sectors were most affected by the pandemic? I think you highlighted some already. I don't know if you could drill down a little bit more further on that.
Right. COVID was something that I think really was an eye-opener for us. We looked at the mega drivers of change. We were seeing globalization, we were seeing climate change, we were seeing demographics, labor migration, and now we have to add pathogens to that, right? I mean, who knew that a pathogen can shut down the global economy? So the COVID crisis had an uneven impact between countries and sectors, and also between different socioeconomic groups. The 4 sectors that were hit the hardest and suffering massive job loss, starting at the top of the list, is accommodation and food services. This declined by 20% globally. Real estate, business and administration services were the second hardest hit sector, then manufacturing, and wholesale and retail trade. I mean, there's a cascading effect when you have a kind of a very well integrated global value chain. And of course, people are in lockdown. They don't have the wherewithal to buy the goods and services. So it does have an impact on the wider economy. By contrast to all those other sectors, employment in both information and communication and financial services had increased. So information communication by 5% and financial and insurance activities by 3.4%. Countries like Brazil, Costa Rica, Spain, the United States have experienced a great divergence between sectors more than other countries. The greater impact we saw was on women. This was a crisis of women's employment, of young people and vulnerable workers in terms of their working hours and loss of employment. And added to this were the uneven effects in the crisis of the post-support labor income, disaggregated by their socioeconomic status. So post-support labor income refers to all income that's linked to the income support measures that were put in place by governments to address the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Obviously, there were some trends that were occurring during the course prior to the pandemic. What types of labor market trends actually sped up or accelerated because of the pandemic?
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you phrase it as accelerated, because there were a lot of structural problems that we faced. So basically, we had growing inequalities in informality. Some countries' informality is 80% or 90% of their economy. The impact of the penetration of digital technologies and business processes, right? There is a displacement of workers from skilled jobs that were being overtaken by technology. And we can maybe talk a bit more about how that's not as dire as it sounds, at least over the longer term. There was job insecurity. People were shift workers, people were doing piecework. So very difficult for people. We also had seen as I mentioned before, a declining share of income from wages and also greater labor migration. I mean, labor migration comes about because people don't have opportunities for themselves and they're looking for better jobs. If I can just take a few seconds to look at what some of the major findings from an analysis we did on several countries, and that was Brazil, Italy, Peru, the United Kingdom, United States, and Vietnam. So what did we find? We found that working hour losses have led to large reductions in labor income, and the impact on post-support labor income varies significantly depending upon the size of the support measures. So for example, in Peru, you had post-income support plunged by 56%, along with a decline of 56% of working hours. As example, the opposite would be the United Kingdom, which experienced the smallest impact, where there was only a decline of 3% in income compared to the 18% drop in hours. So there was a benefit to having that income support. Other countries like the UK and Italy relied on large-scale job retention schemes, which had subsidized the incomes of workers who were on furlough. And the job retention schemes are really quite important because it allowed companies to retain employees. So when things got better, they were able to move right back in and take advantage of the pent-up demand. The second finding we had is that young workers between 15 and 24 years had experienced much larger decreases in post-income labor support than the overall population. So young people were particularly affected by the pandemic. COVID also had a disproportionate impact on self-employment. This stood at 21 percentage points between those who were in regular employment and those who were self-employed. The fourth finding that we had is that women had tended to experience significant drops in post-support labor income in some but not all countries. And what we're finding now is that a lot of women who were contributing to the family, both in terms of family responsibilities, but also going to work and earning incomes and at sometimes extremely high levels. But someone had to be there to look after the children. Some had to be there to deal with, I think, the concerns that had happened through COVID is also the mental health. How do we survive this? We're separated from our family, our friends, our schools, our natural routines. Someone had to be there to help support, and disproportionately that has fallen upon women. There was also the losses in support income for the workers in low and medium skilled. So people in the high skills, managers, professionals, and technicians, they were lesser affected than those who were in the medium skills like clerical, sales, and agriculture. Finally, just to say that inequality is likely to increase, as a result of the type of job loss generated by the crisis itself.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it highlights something interesting I'd like to follow up on for a minute. And like you talk about, like in Europe, some of the job schemes there, when there's a downturn, whether it's a normal recession or in this case, the pandemic, there is still some way of still holding on to that labor. Whereas in the US, when you hit the impact of a recession, or in this case, the pandemic, workers are fired or laid off. And now when we want to go back to trying to rehire those workers, would you say that it's harder or more difficult to rehire workers in the US than it would be, say, in some European countries, that there's ways of retaining those workers quicker than in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I would split that into two. So, I mean, you mentioned about retaining workers. So in Germany, which had lower infection rates and better controls in testing and tracing. And so employers were encouraged not to lay off those workers. This is Kurzarbeit, is a short-term work program, which typically paid 60% of the workers' wages. So those workers were ready to go back into production as soon as things got better. No one knew how long it would take. In the US, policy-wise, we waited until companies had laid off people, and then the government stepped in with benefits. So what is better? So if you say that if the economy is going to bounce back quickly, the European approach appears to be better at keeping jobs and skilled people in those jobs, because any HR manager knows it's expensive to hire people. But if the industries are disappearing, or that the workers need to find new work and new sets of growth areas and moving out of their kind of area of comfort, the US model could speed up that painful transition.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Now this kind of actually segues into another question I have, and let me just elaborate a little bit. As you mentioned, for those of us who studied labor markets, we know that during a crisis, unemployment increases quite rapidly, but it takes a much longer time to get back to full employment. And we have the example of the US where unemployment fell to 3.5% in 2020, January 2020. It was the lowest since 1969, and yet now it rose to 15% in April 2020, so a very quick increase in unemployment. And then as of March 2021, unemployment is currently at 6%. But if you include those who were dropped out of labor force, the unemployment rate is actually closer to 9%. There's been an argument made that with the generous unemployment benefits and the pandemic aid, that this is limiting workers from getting back into the labor force. Is there any validity to that argument?
Right. As you know, with economics, David, you can make your case depending on the data sets that you're analyzing.
Absolutely.
I would say generally, no. I don't think that providing those benefits, which were time-bound, which were very specific, is a disincentive to work, because you can't continue to do that. So look at the income support, right? All that relief goes right back into the economy in the form of rents or mortgage payments or electrical or cable bill, internet services. I mean, we're putting that money right back into the economy. People are not taking those stimulus checks and investing them, right? I mean, I think by and large, it's just helping people ride out the unemployment itself too. And we have to also look, I think, below the surface a bit too, that the labor market, as we mentioned before, was not doing as well as we had wanted, right? So yes, in January of 2020, we had 3.5% unemployment, right? So the lowest in 20 years. But the ongoing issues that were behind all of that, when you talk to people, it tells a different story. So people who were looking for jobs or even had jobs, these were long job searches. Sometimes they were trouble finding a good fit for themselves in employment with a good paid job. There were unpredictable hours. They were at times reluctant to move for work because, manufacturing has largely reduced in the United States, but we're in transition. So we are moving, as most economic development economists will tell you, you may have an agrarian economy and that goes to manufacturing, and then manufacturing will go then to a technological base or a knowledge-based economy. And now we're in an innovation economy where, using big data and using artificial intelligence to really create new modes of operation. So I think what we were seeing is that there was a lot of slack in the job market because there was a prevalence of low quality jobs. And these are these jobs had been, impacted by outsourcing to complex global value chains, investments in technology, which shifted the needs of workers or the needs of HR for that. And also a lot of companies were changing their hiring practice. So instead of hiring a full-time employee, they would then go to a hiring service and hire somebody on a case-by-case basis, or there was even a misclassification of workers. I think the other dynamic that we had seen was kind of this hollowing out of the middle. And this was just a historical trend that, in advanced economies, the increased demand for high-skilled and high-wage workers as compared to the low-skilled workers, the middle-income ones had declined. If you go to a factory, you don't see, these assembly lines, jam-packed with workers. What you see are a few engineers operating these very complex systems through screen interfaces with highly sophisticated equipment on work that was done by humans. So technological advancement is driving down the cost of capital. Firms then are replacing those workers with machines and outsourcing to countries with lower labor costs. Now, I just wanted to make one little comment, excuse me, and a cautionary note for business. It's not just about workers. It's about companies themselves. Even though companies, are thriving and using technology to their benefit, and we can talk about digital platforms in a moment, but how long would it take for AI to replace a manager or a chief financial officer or a CEO with an algorithm? Businesses are starting to change. They're becoming atomized and they're pulling together, in a different structure, almost like a molecular bond, or maybe to use a simile, which is current now, a constantly mutating virus, that it has a small core and combining functions and processes as we need them and then disbanding. So it's not just about the workers losing their job, but it's about the structure and nature and organization of work, which is changing. And that is different from developed or emerging and developing economies.
Okay, great. Thank you. There might be some points where I might follow back up, but I see one question that has to deal with asked about the digital divide. So as we talk about the future of the labor market after COVID, I guess this might be tied to the issue of automation, is what you're really getting to. And we talked about automation even well before COVID, and like you said, especially when you look at the issue of the semiconductor chip issue and the shortage there, is because of the increased digitalization of the world now because of COVID. Is there a real concern about more automation replacing jobs? Should we really be concerned about that? If you could first elaborate on that, maybe I'll have a follow-up question for you on that.
Sure. Look, technology is having an impact, but technology has always had an impact, right? Where we can go back from going from a canoe to a sailboat or to ocean-going ships. We can go, from the wooden plow to modern combine harvesters. So technology has always been influencing the world of work. This particular phase has shifted from technology that was helping us with the heavy lifting, the more physical work, to now shifting to the computational and the analytical work. So that's the difference between these two technological revolutions. We do believe that, for example, when we start to look at, what's going to happen after this, and you mentioned, David, for example, chip production. I mean, that will be a big strategic focus for all governments and for companies, right? I mean, right now, the car manufacturing sector are facing a shortfall in chips because there's a competition. Most consumer devices today, the Internet of Everything, have chips. And through our global supply chains, which have been seriously affected by COVID-19, these chips are produced almost exclusively in East Asia, with countries like Korea, China, and Taiwan dominating it. But even in that market, there's one company, TSMC in Taiwan, which dominates almost 90% of that. So we have to diversify those markets. I know we spent a lot of time developing vertical global supply chains where everything was integrated. But when we started looking for PPE and started looking now in India, looking for oxygen, and so and even in Switzerland, where it's the home of pharmaceuticals, where they make the vaccines that we are getting the shots in the arms today, they're suffering because they don't have enough even for their own populations there. So I think there's going to be a lot of focus on the technological issue as it impacts upon global supply chains, which is a characteristic and will be increasingly so in our modern economy.
Yeah. And actually, this last Sunday, I think 60 Minutes had a very interesting discussion about the TSMC and them actually building the plant in near Phoenix, I think Arizona, and but it's still acknowledging how long it's going to take to do that. So we've also talked about the idea of supply chain changes because of the pandemic. So when we talk about automation, I think at the same time we have to say that it's not a one-way street where we're so worried about the whole world being automated. It's not going to be the case, and that we have to look at that when jobs are lost because of automation, it means that there could be new jobs created. But most of those jobs, I guess you would agree, that are more high-skilled jobs. So we have to create some kind of transition or some kind of support for those who lose jobs to automation to be able to move in other parts of the workforce. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think
Yeah.
some of the things that we're looking at, for example, you mentioned the technologies, we've been discussing it slightly. This offers opportunities for better paying jobs. I mean, the higher the technology, the higher the pay of the job. But you also then have to look at skilling the workforce. And, these are 10, 20, 30-year rollouts. So you have to work with industry and governments together to kind of say, what are the emerging jobs? What are the skills that we'll need? Skills are becoming quickly obsolete. So we need to have an educational program that makes you ready for the future of work, but also those in the jobs who are losing it, that transition, how do we help reskill or upskill the people to take over the new jobs? And there will be obviously other drivers of change as well too, in terms of climate change and using technologies such as solar power, wind power, biothermal, wave technology to generate electricity. There is demographics moving, and also with that, the care economy. I think a lot of people out there are in that sandwich generation where you have kids and you also have parents or grandparents that you're looking after. I mean, this is going to create tremendous opportunities for the care economy. But we have to be careful, I think, and this is globally, and it does happen in the US too, as well, about these inequalities and poverty, because it's easier for someone to contribute to society if they have a job and they're skilled for that job. So we need to ensure equal access to, or access to, quality education so that they can become more productive in society. And then we have to create those safety nets so that when people, sometimes through no fault of their own, will fall below poverty, and how do we help them? And that help, just to be honest, goes right back into the economy. And there are multiplier effects of giving somebody who is poor $1, which has, I think, $1.78 impact, as those who get extra dollar, and that goes into investment, which has less than $1 return. So I'm not terribly worried about the short-term impacts about creating social safety nets. I think it's important to help the country and the globe move forward to expand the pie, rather than looking how do we divide up the current pie.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, there's another interesting question in the chat, and I might just elaborate a little bit on it. One person is asking that any thoughts about where people will work? It talks about aspects of you working remotely. Is this also a global theme? If I could just elaborate for a second, because when we talk about especially automation and people losing their jobs, especially low skill workers losing their jobs, the low skill workers, I think, have a harder time moving to new locations, whereas someone who's more high skill might have more job flexibility, because we generally look at the U.S. as being a very flexible labor market. But I think, and this is my hypothesis, I haven't really tested it, but I think that low skill workers might have more difficulty try to move where jobs are located at. In terms of this question in the chat, does the post-COVID world change that now? Can jobs come to people rather than people going to jobs?
Yeah, but I think you've hit on something that's quite important on two levels. Number one, yes, technology can help people who are, staying at home because they have to look after the kids or have family responsibilities, persons with disabilities, people in remote locations. So, and I think COVID has shown us, that we all are working from home. I'm sitting actually in my library with my backstop here of the ILO banner. But around me, I'm in a television studio. I have my lights here. I have my technology in front of me. I'm able to conduct business as if I was with people. Now, we're all in the people business. We are social animals. I think one of the downsides, of course, is that we want to be with people. But technology does allow us to work on these issues. And I can talk a little bit in a moment about how the digital platforms for the labor markets have actually helped find work for people who would otherwise not be available to it. But the recovery itself is going to be a bit uncertain, and there are lots of different aspects that will come into effect. So that will be health-related factors like the rollout of the vaccines and how fast we can get back to whatever that new normal is. We'll also be looking at the portion of jobs that are teleworkable, right? Not everybody can telework. An electrician has to be on the job, a security guard, a sanitation worker, a bus driver, they have to be on the job, EMTs, doctors, nurses. These are all people who are essential workers, who are on the front line, who can't just phone it in. So I think we have to be very careful to understand that it's an important market ahead, but that there is a pent-up demand, and the IMF shows that when things, and their projections are that in the latter half of 2021, we'll see the economy globally growing by 6%, which will then moderate to about 4.4% in 2002. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity for technology, but as people in the trades tell me, you can't have a robot do the electricity. You can't have a robot who's doing the plumbing. These are technical jobs that we just haven't gotten the technology right. I mentioned eventually we'll be able to do that, but I think between now and then we'll shift to new jobs, and in an innovation economy, hopefully the access to education and higher level jobs will be commensurate with the skill sets and the upskilling of workers as we move forward into the next century.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, and I think another important aspect, and when you talked about the income inequality issue, obviously, we learned too from the pandemic that there's a technological inequality. Not everybody has access to appropriate technology, especially for education and for students, and so that was very key during the pandemic. Again, in the chat, we're getting many questions again about the digital divide, how will it play out, especially with the rollout with 5G and connectivity. You mentioned this a minute ago that you could elaborate a little bit more on the digitization of the labor market. Is there anything more you want to add in that regard? There's also another question about blockchain. Is that going to be positive or negative for the workforce? So I don't know if there's something you'd like to add on that front.
Yeah, before I launch into a bit of a breathless narrative, because we've just come out with a report on digital labor platforms, we do have to be careful that, human is still in charge of technology. And also there are privacy issues. So for example, in Europe, there are data privacy acts, which mean that blockchain can't really work there because once it's an electronic ledger, once it's in there, you can't change it. So people have the right to be kind of erase their past, so to speak, on the internet. So it does create ethical issues as well. And as we know, algorithms, they're written by humans, so they could embed actually prejudices into those algorithms. So you have to be a bit careful about the technology not just being given over to technology's sake. In terms of digital labor platforms, there's been a five-fold increase in digital labor platforms. This has largely been concentrated in a few countries, mainly in the US and to a lesser extent, India and the United Kingdom. This has also created a growing digital divide and has been accentuated by the fact that 96% of investment in these digital platforms have been concentrated in North America, Europe, and Asia. So that digital divide is not only between, say, the Central Asia or the Middle East or in Africa, but also from urban to rural areas. I think some will know that some of the plans right now are to roll out access to the internet in rural areas as well. I think it's an information age, it's an innovation age. We need to have that. 70% of the revenues generated by the digital labor platforms were concentrated in just two countries. United States, which took 49% of that, and China, which took 22%. So those are the countries that are roaring ahead with this. And it is a comparative and competitive advantage. And we were talking before, what do these digital labor platforms do? They foster new business opportunities. They redefine how economic relationships are being established between the worker and the client. You have Upwork and TaskRabbit. Sometimes there is no there's no mediation on that. So if you do work, maybe your work is rejected and you have no mediation to get paid for that. So it does create some problems. But technology and digital platforms are expanding those business customer bases, creating those new job opportunities for workers such as I mentioned, women, persons with disability, and young people. But you have to realize that it's a limited market, and when you get your degree this year, maybe 2, 3 years, 4 years, you'll be at the top of the heap. But then after that, there is a whole flood of new people coming into the market with new skills and being upskilled from where you were. So you're going to have higher competition. So we need to focus on, at least for the ILO, we focus on some of the downsides, which is how organization of work is done and how workers access labor markets, sometimes having to pay a fee. It also blurs the distinction between an employee and a self-employed individual. And if you're self-employed, the onus is on you. Your pension, your benefits, all that is on you. Are we able to make enough money to save for that? I mean, David, I think we're probably the last generation that will have a proper pension, whether it's defined contributions or contributory. That's going to be an unknown topic to a lot of young people. And workers will often struggle because they're a single voice. They don't have a collective bargaining opportunity. I mean, I work in an international organization, and the benefits and salaries are well defined because we're all, highly trained and in highly competitive jobs. So those benefits have to be outlined. But if you're going to other work, which is outsourced, and you don't know really who your employer is, it creates that asymmetrical power relationship. So it's very hard for individuals to be able to advocate for themselves. So we just want to make sure that we don't create a whole generation of digital day laborers. And I think that's one of the things that we have.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, thank you. It seems like this whole movement toward what you kind of highlighted. Maybe I'm extrapolating. You could correct me if I'm wrong. That there's this race for technological supremacy between U.S. and China. Is that really going to accelerate the degree of digitization in the labor market? And are we going to see any important spillover effects, to the rest of the world, so that the rest of the world can also benefit from this rapid increase in technology that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe the robots are coming for our jobs. You know, there are discussions about how the analytical work, and even there are algorithms now that could paint, that could create music. I mean, again, it's an interesting future ahead. I don't think I will live through that. I think you know that will take place, and it is also a political decision how much of the penetration of technology which will displace workers. So, for an example, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, where nearly 80% of your workforce is working in agriculture. Now, you could bring in, you know, GPS-enabled combine harvesters and have food security, and it hardly is touched by an individual. But you're displacing tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people without creating jobs for them. So what do? Right? And then, as I said, you need to put in place certain things. So here are the certain elements that I think we need to look at when we look at technology or any other disruption, whether it be climate change or demographics. I mean, you know, U.S. is aging, Japan is aging. The young growth is happening in the Middle East and in Africa. So a lot of these countries and regions can leapfrog by putting in place good training and educational systems. So where we recommend to policymakers is to invest in education and skilling for a talented future workforce. That is absolutely essential. We'll be more competitive because we'll be more connected. We also need to strengthen those social protection systems and occupational safety and health infrastructure. So social protection is this life cycle approach, which means that you have access to nutrition for the children, because it's very important that children have the right nutrition. It's important for their brain function and for their normal development. Access to, say, pre-K education. Those who have the pre-K actually do better in school than those who don't have that. It's about accessing the transition from school to work. Where are the workforce development organizations and infrastructure? So we need to have that active labor market policies to help people transition into the world of work. We need to also look at the changes between jobs to jobs, and how do we do that? There are systems like LinkedIn which help us identify potential opportunities, but not everybody is at that level. You know, we're talking about a very small part of the workforce, and the large part is still in the middle and the lower end of that. And also looking at preparing for well, I think as we can call it today, a low carbon digital future. By having the transition out of fossil fuels and then having a just transition for those who are losing their job to higher skilled jobs. I mean, we are also protecting the base in which we draw from. I mean, we are a consumptive country. We can't continually, take every resource out of the earth. At some point in time, there's going to be some price to pay. And I think with that, we can use technology to help ease that transition and then create new jobs. We need to formalize that informal economy. There are too many people who just have no security in the workplace. As I mentioned, countries like India, 80 to 85, 90% is in the informality. What does that mean? Well, it means that they don't have regular jobs. They're not covered by labor protection. They don't contribute to any of these national insurance schemes. And also the country is starved of cash because they don't have income to pay for the programs that are the jobs of countries. Countries need to look after their citizenry. If they can't pave roads, if they can't put in infrastructure, because there's no tax base, they don't have that fiscal space, it creates major problems. So the ILO is really focused about orienting the economies towards a human-centered growth. Effectively, what this means is building human capabilities through economic and social policies. So we focus on investing in the person's capabilities, investing in the institutions of work, and investing in what we call decent and sustainable work. So that's really where we're going with the ILO.
Oh, that's great. Great. Thank you for laying that out, Kevin. You brought up a point about labor market shortage. Let me just kind of for the audience just to kind of elaborate a little bit. For instance, we could look back at the latest census, the 2020 census. It showed that the 2010s saw the second lowest population growth in the nation's history. The 2010s registered declines in the number of births, increased number of deaths, and lower immigration levels. And as you also highlighted, we're also seeing that the U.S. economy is beginning to age. These, again, appear to be signals that we are facing a labor market shortage. And if that's correct, what are the remedies for it? Should we raise the retirement age? Should we incentivize birth? Should we increase immigration? Or does this give a incentive for more automation because of labor shortage? Can you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is going to be different in different countries. We were talking about before the mega drivers of change. That was something we were looking at on the advent of our 100th commemoration. Without a doubt, as the population ages, how are we going to be able to have that new generation of the workforce? How are we going to be able to pay for the elderly in society? There's a lot of programs on health, on education, that are paid for, excuse me, by the higher earners. So as that number thins out, then you start to lose competitive advantage around the world. And no amount of technology is going to replace that. So having skilled workforce is very important. Whether we incentivize births, I'm afraid I'm not a population specialist, so I won't really go into that. But raising the retirement age, sometimes that has a crowding out effect of the younger workers. We found that younger workers who don't get their foot onto the job ladder in the first 4 years of graduating from either an undergraduate or a graduate degree, that sets them back 10 years in their job career. So we do have to look at the jobs that are coming up and ensuring that there are skills that people have that meet the needs for that. Labor migration is continuing. I think again, maybe to speak about a topical issue, there is a strategy right now. The U.S. government is looking at, the sort of northern triangle where you have lots of people migrating because they see, the U.S. as a beacon for jobs. And labor migration goes on all around the world. It's not just within, the Americas. And a lot of the migration is actually internal. In China, internal labor migration is the greatest, coming from these rural provinces, coming to the export processing zones along the coast where the job opportunities are. But then what happens is you have tons of people working. Then it has a downward pressure on the wages, and then unfortunately there may be unscrupulous employers who will take advantage of that. So again, we have to be careful that the oversupply of labor may create a downward pressure, and then you have this bifurcation where you have high-skilled, high-paid people and low-skilled, low-paid people, and you've created inequalities. And as we have seen, and I'll go back to where the ILO was created, out of World War I, out of great tragedy, there was a need to have a protection on the labor markets themselves, because economic problems spill into the social sphere, which then spill over into the political sphere. So I think we have to be a bit careful to ensure that it's not just looking after the most wealthy, but also looking at those people who may not have opportunities, and how do we create opportunities for them in order to take advantage of this. So it is decades long. So we have to have an over the horizon view about how we're going to be looking at the labor market. If it's just about here and now, it gives you a very skewed view, and it's not a very good measure of where things are going.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, and to look at the forward-looking points of the labor market, if you look at the recent speech by President Biden to Congress, he said, and I quote, "We'll see more technological change in the next 10 years than we saw in the last 50." Do you see that the U.S. economy, at least the workers in the U.S., are going to be able to meet the demands for such rapid technological change? And what I think you kind of highlighted what some of those jobs might be, but if you can just elaborate, is this going to help everybody? Those who are low skilled, will be able to still incorporate them into the labor force, given for looking at such rapid technological change going forward?
I'm an optimistic person by nature. Why else would I work in the UN system? I do believe in the human capacity for growth, for compassion, and for improvement of life. Look, I think President Biden's statement about the technological change. I was in a forum out in the World Economic Forum out in the Presidio in California, and some of the technologists out there were talking about saying you've not seen anything yet in terms of technological innovations. We have nanotechnologies that are transforming science and transforming medical procedures. So at one day you'll be able to swallow a liquid that has in a suspension fluid, some of the nanotechnologies that will go in and fix your heart, or that you will have some of the RNA medicines that are coming out now to help the body learn how to fight certain diseases. So I do think that technological changes will have a tremendous impact on our life. I was with a scientist in the University of Texas in Galveston, and she's working on reanimating pig's lungs. Pig's lungs are very similar to human lungs in the sense that it has an extra ventricle, but she was looking at it so that you can grow lungs. So instead of having to wait for a donor, you can use somebody's DNA and create a new lung for that person that would not be rejected. Her research was also looking at space travel, the impact of low gravity on those lungs. So I believe that the elements are there for great technological advancement. Now, and as I said before, how much you introduce this technology into your country will really depend upon political issues as well too. The example of sub-Saharan Africa, you cannot just totally impoverish tens of millions of people. Those countries would no longer have the leaders that they have if in fact these people would not have jobs, because people are not like pigeons. We don't go away. We struggle to survive. We want to have job. We want to have worth. Jobs define us. Jobs give us a connection to reality. Jobs help us move along with our families. It affords us the opportunity to advance. I mean, my grandfather, who came from Ireland, worked a job that he thought was below him, but he worked the job because he knew that he wanted his daughter, my mother, to go to school. She graduated in her class of 3 women, undergraduate, and the only woman in her master's class. And she wanted me to do better. So I think it's that ethos that we want the next generation to do better. So by providing access to education, by providing access to opportunities, by providing access to the medical techniques that we need in order to help us live better lives, because a healthy worker is a more productive worker. So I think all of these come into play. So I am positive about the future on this, but we have to look at the fact of how do we equitably share this, because we do believe in equitable, inclusive workplaces and sustainable workplaces. This is really quite important for the ILO.
Well, thank you. And I think your optimism is very much appreciated during we look at a very challenging still future to face. Let me ask you one more question. I think when we look at the post-global financial crisis period and we look at the current period, I think we can say that the return of work, at least, is occurring a little faster than it did after the global financial crisis. And I think a lot of that has to do with the more activist government policies, whether it's the unemployment benefits or the relief packages, or even the fact that central banks are including employment as part of their mandates. Do you see government activism in the labor market more sustained going forward, or is this only because of the pandemic that we're seeing this?
Yeah, maybe I could put that in context for a term maybe some of you have heard, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN have these SDGs, which are 17 goals. And this covers everything from poverty to hunger to women's empowerment, climate change, protection of the environment, both above sea and below sea, and a range of other issues as well too. Having a good job is absolutely critical to all of that. With a good job, I can pull myself out of poverty. We've seen that. China, for example, has done that for almost 100 million people. Now, they may not be the best jobs, but they were better than they had before. And we hope that they move up and they have a rights-based approach and that workers are protected, because rights in the workplace are not just for workers, they're for management as well too. So I think having a good job will help pull people out of poverty. A good job will give people opportunities. It will help advance women, because I think if we're going to grow as a country, we need to have more women in the workforce. We need to have more access to not only STEM, the science, technology, sort of approach, but also adding A to that, so STEAM skills. So it is the science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths, because you have different hemispheres of your brain. So, the creative arts is actually an important growth as well too. So we need to look at all of those issues so that we don't just come out with a kind of a rubber stamp of, this is the kind of worker we have in the future. Most employers today are looking for people who are problem solvers, people who can communicate well, people who could work together well in a team, and these are important, kind of cognitive skills beyond just the hard skills. So I do think that, at the end of the day, in order to to boost productivity, in order to have a more effective economy for people. And just a small sidebar, that in this age of globalization, we have never been more connected than we have at this time than we have ever been in the history of humankind. That does require greater and better institutions, either at the government level or at the state level, the federal and state level. I mean, it's a big world, and we need a big machinery to help us navigate that. So investing in people's capabilities and looking at lifelong learning, looking at supportive transitions from work to work and work to retirement, looking at gender equality, absolutely essential. Looking at ensuring that people have time sovereignty, so that with COVID, it's shown us that we can set our own hours and we can still be productive. I think that most workers have done that. And I travel around the world quite a lot, and I don't find people who are just sitting back and waiting to be given money. I think people feel that work is important to them. And the only way to understand what the concerns are of people is this issue of dialogue, what we call social dialogue, which is any communication between workers and employers to understand what their concerns and challenges and where are the opportunities to move forward. And what that requires, and this will be, I think, maybe the main point I'd like to leave with people, is that compromise is not a dirty word. At the UN, at the ILO in particular, we believe in bringing different voices to the table. I may not understand why somebody has a particular position on something, but until I hear from that person, understand why they think that, it's not right for me to just discredit that or discount that. I think it's important to understand that compromise is the way that we move forward as society and our policies. And by having that, we can be actually more sustainable in our approaches, and people feel that they have skin in the game, that they are a part of the change themselves. And that's what you need. You need people to be optimistic about where they're going, because if people lose that optimism, if they feel that the system is failing them, they're not going to be able to put their best and their best foot forward and to give their all to that. So I think just generally that to me is really quite important, that idea of dialogue and communication.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And I think that's a great way to end our discussion in a very optimistic tone. So I really appreciate that. Again, I want to thank you for your participating in this discussion. I think we're all better informed now than we came into this discussion on the future of the labor market. So I appreciate your time and your insights. Again, I also want to thank Marian and the Global Ties Organization and Gulf Coast Diplomacy for hosting this event. And I also want to thank our audience for joining us today and submitting their questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions. I couldn't get to all of mine either, but maybe there's opportunity that we can continue this discussion sometime in the future. So again, thank you. And let me hand it back to Marian or Melissa.
Yeah, thank you, David. I will just take it to say goodbye. I wanted to reiterate what you said. Thank you both to our speakers for that fascinating discussion and for everyone that joined today. I wanted to make a quick announcement that our partners at the Gulf Coast Diplomacy will be hosting a Small World Cafe event, which will be a speaker from Tunisia talking about the current issues that the Berber people of North Africa are facing from a political perspective. So that should be really interesting. That's on Tuesday, May 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So tune in for that. And yeah, thank you again, David and Kevin. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and we will see you again soon for our next discussion. Marian, I don't know if you had any last words or if we should just say goodbye.
And just again, thanks. I really like the parting comments about compromise and hearing other viewpoints and communication. It's what Global Ties Detroit and the Global Ties US network are all about. It's also evidently ILO is listening to a lot of different voices to formulate their work and their opinions. And once again, I want to thank David Teolis and GM and the many people who have attended this event. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation on a global format. So thank you again, everybody. Good to see you. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.